openly, but they want to like bring the information that they've got to political rulers, heads of state, stuff like that, which is a reasonable thing for someone to want to do in that position. Just as I would note as a subnote to that yes, like this is what Crowley did as well. He wasn't trolling college campuses trying to convince 22-year-old fucking art students to convert to Thelema. He was writing heads of industry, heads of state, people like that. Which is the same thing Dee and Kelly were doing. There's one point that Dee's freaking out. Basically, his wife is sick. They don't have money. They've hit a blockade, and he's getting upset. And he, not too long ago, before this happens, he asks the angels specifically for financial help, and they get really pissed off, and they just kind of like rain right down on him, like who the hell do you think you are? Basically, like, don't ask us for that. Which is odd. Speaking as someone who has worked with the Enochian system, Enochian angels, in my experience and the experience of the people that I know who actually have worked with them, usually are fairly willing to, unlike more demonic entities where it's kind of a quid pro quo arrangement and you have to kind of like, okay, I'll give you this, you give me that, blah, blah, blah. If they want to help, they're helpful. If they don't want to help, then fuck you, essentially. But it gets to the point where this is afterward, and Dee's trying to get to this idea of maybe, you guys can help us out. And they tell him what I call the parable of the adder. And every time that I look at this, I think back to the line in the Book of the Law, thou shalt have worry and trouble. It's basically telling us, the spirits, we will fuck with you. We will fuck with you, and things will be crazy, and like your life will get intense, but at the same time, if you go through it, you will be fine. And in the parable of the adder, the angels are basically describing a mother snake and the baby snakes. And she flips up her tail to make it look like a predator, essentially, and scares the little baby snakes. It's constantly scaring them, but they're really safe. They're being protected. And this is the angels' kind of way of saying, like, if you guys think that you're getting messed with, you're getting fucked with, well, just go through it, There's no real danger, basically. How well that works out in practice is debatable. I mean, Dee and Kelly obviously had some very serious real-life problems during their run. And Dee had his house burnt down while he was away doing this stuff, and Kelly died under dubious circumstances. At the same time, what the angels say when they tell them this parable is like, we know what's going to happen already. We know what the outcome is. The outcome is you're not going to trust us, and you're going to fuck up, and you're going to lose the thread, basically. Like, they make this clear earlier on. And this actually happens before the infamous wife swap that takes place. And I think that that's significant as well. There's a period where they're kind of like, okay, you guys aren't going to make it when it comes to that. And that is the next important point that I want to get to before we completely exhaust the topic. The wife swap. I'm sure we all know what we're talking about. There's a point in time where the angels tell Dee and Kelly, to have sex with each other's wives, basically. There's a period, there's a communication before that, which is sort of infamous, which is one of the ones that happens just with Kelly on his own, where he's kind of like, where the angels tell him, the stories in the Bible, they're not literally true, they're not to be taken as history, Jesus is not to be worshipped as God, there's no such thing as a Holy Spirit, and so on and so forth. Kelly and Dee are very upset by this, and then Dee mentions at one point that he says, they said this, and they said other things that were just too terrible to write down. And it's like, okay, well, looking at the place and looking at the time, the fact that he wrote down the things that he wrote down, I would say that, yes, there's more that I don't even want to talk about, is kind of intense. And this is my personal opinion, which I hate to interject with, but I have nonetheless. I believe that there's a homosexual component to what was being said, and I believe there's a homosexual component to Enochian magic in general. I think that if Dee was willing to write that there was no Holy Spirit and Jesus shouldn't be worshipped as God and the Bible isn't true, and there was something he was afraid to write down, I can't think of very many other things that would fall into that category during that place and time. Also, it is significant once again, the effect is prefigured in the cause. As I said when I started this, Liber 418 is arguably the most significant piece of, what do I want to call it, the most significant product of the Enochian system that exists, period. And that was a series of homosexual magical workings between Aleister Crowley and Victor Newburgh. It's indisputable that Crowley used heterosexual and homosexual magic in terms of sex magic, but at the same time, this was the only time that he produced anything remotely like this. Remotely. And particularly in terms of Crowley's own initiatory experience. As I mentioned Eliphas Levi earlier on, Crowley claimed that he was the reincarnation of Levi, and when Crowley set up the AA, the exempt addict grade requires that someone write a thesis, essentially explaining their view of the universe. For Crowley's own experience with this, he didn't come up with a new thing. He actually just translated Levi's Key of the Mysteries, which he considered to be, a version of this. And if you look at Key of the Mysteries and you looked at Liber 418, they have a lot of similarities. Key of the Mysteries is very Christian. It's clearly Christian. Levi was Christian. It's a Christian book. At the same time, it offers a radical form of biblical interpretation, which is very much echoed in Liber 418. And you can see the relationship between the two books very clearly, because Liber 418 goes out of its way to talk about this is how we want to understand the myth of Cain and Abel. This is how we want to understand Noah and the Ark. This is how we want to understand Adam and Eve. And these are the ways that we're going to look at these stories, which is exactly what Levi does in Key of the Mysteries. And Crowley had already confronted these ideas before he started to have these kind of visions and mystically look at them and so on and so forth. And it's important to remember that and look at the relationship between those two things, because there is a distinct relationship between those two things. As I think there was a relationship between the life of Kelly, the life of Levi, and the life of Crowley, which is not to be easily discounted. And this is very important in Thelema. It's do we take this idea seriously or not? Do we really believe in reincarnation, or is it just a nice story? What are we seriously taking out of this? I think that basically, coming back to the parable of the adder, essentially, what the spirits are telling Kelly and Dee is what kind of gets echoed later on when Crowley's having communications and there's other people talking with them, essentially saying that people are being constantly tested by these entities, and these people are constantly testing these entities, hopefully, if they're doing this right. And it's kind of that mutual, what's the word I want? Suspicion, maybe? Mutual suspicion. I mean, a good ceremonial magician, I would hope, would be suspicious of the entities that they're talking to a certain degree. And it's a balancing act. And as we've seen with Crowley, as we see with Dee and Kelly, if you go too far to one side of that, you don't want to be too credulous. You don't want to just take every piece of information that you get. At the same time, you also don't want to piss off a higher intelligence from beyond who's telling you what should be going on, and you're there wondering whether it's a C or a K at the end of magic, and this is a really important point for you, and you've got to fucking harp on it. And yeah, so looking at actually, I'll stop for a sec. Is there any questions or anything I can clear up before I get into details here?
I think it's interesting that A True and Faithful was originally published in order to discredit the work that Dee and Kelly did. It's
yes.
The only source. It's not the only source, but it was. It's the major source of what we have that's extant of.
And I personally, I do not trust this typescript. There are points where there are words that I'm just I'm sure this is not actually the word that it's supposed to be, because if you look at the sentence in context, it would make way more sense with something else that's almost the same, basically.
Yeah.
It's definitely been fucked with. And